Sorry about our technical issues. We're ready to go now. As advertised, we've got Bob Allen, who is quite an important individual as regards the London recruits. He's a trade unionist, an activist, and he was involved in recruiting secret agents from the UK to go to apartheid South Africa to carry out covert missions for both the ANC and the underground, at great personal risk to the individuals who were involved in those missions. So Bob is going to tell us his story. He's going to be, the lecture and slides should be about an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time after that for question and answer session.
Using the way.
So I will now hand over to Bob. Bob, whenever you're ready, fire away. Thank you very much.
Okay. So to all my family, friends, comrades, whoever is watching tonight, a warm welcome from me. And I want to tell you a very personal story, which some of you may have heard part of, and others may have heard none of it. So here we go. I want to also say that, hang on. I want to also say that this is not an exercise in nostalgia, even though the story does go back to the 60s and 70s, but one of great relevance to current struggles for equality and justice. The book, London Recruits, The Secret War Against Apartheid, edited by Ken Keeble and published by Merlin Press, is shortly to be made into a documentary film. And what the book describes are the brave deeds of real life heroes, many of whom I'm proud to have known as lifelong friends. So this is their story. Perhaps during the 20th century, there were two struggles that over time won almost universal support. First, that rare thing, the just war, namely the Second World War against fascism and Nazism. And secondly, the just struggle against the brutal racist apartheid regime in South Africa. And from the late 1960s, our brave comrades carried out secret missions for the African National Congress and MK. Just as a personal aside at this point, I should explain that I was born and brought up in a village called Kimberley, not the one in South Africa, but the one in the Nottinghamshire coalfield. And my dad, who was in the Royal Navy during the Second World War, defending the Atlantic convoys. And I imbibed his values. He was a lifelong trade unionist and communist, and he argued incessantly for freedom and social justice and workers' rights and so on. And that progress could be achieved through collective action and cooperation. He taught me many things. He used to say, for instance, it's not about knowing all the answers, lad. It's about asking the right questions. And that when you struggle for justice, sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. But if you stand on the sidelines, you lose. Bertolt Brecht ably described people like my dad when he wrote, "There are those that struggle for a day, and this is good. There are those that struggle all their lives, and they're the ones we cannot live without." So thanks, Dad. Thus I became immersed in radical politics at a very early age, 14, 15. And in 1969, I became the full-time district secretary of the Young Communist League in London, but discovered that I had an unofficial element to my job, namely recruiting comrades to carry out highly dangerous secret missions in South Africa on behalf of the then illegal African National Congress. Who were they? What was the nature of the struggle they were part of? What was the wider context and how did they fit into it? What are the lessons for us today? Without attempting a detailed history, here's my take on that. Whilst victory in the World War II produced powerful demands for a better deal for ordinary people, and a lot of progress was undoubtedly made. However, the world became increasingly bipolar. The Cold War, East versus West, communism versus capitalism, intense struggles for national liberation across the world. Apartheid South Africa was seen for a long time by the powers that be in the West as a bulwark against communism and a huge source of profits from gold, diamond, platinum mining. To use a post-Watergate phrase, if in doubt, follow the money. No wonder that Maggie Thatcher described Nelson Mandela as a terrorist and apartheid South Africa as an ally. Following the victory in 1948 in a whites-only election, the National Party then introduced a series of laws to create this new apartheid state built on the previous Dutch and British colonial exploitation. Laws that entrenched white power, dividing the population into 4 racial groups: white, coloured, Indian and African, and limiting the existing rights for non-whites to effectively 0, leaving that 10% of the population, namely those who were white, in total control, excluding the rest, declaring a republic in 1961. Through the Population Registration Act, Group Areas Act, prohibition of mixed marriages, creation of so-called homelands for black people, the hated pass laws where any black person had to carry a passport controlling where they could be at any time. The great majority of South Africans were condemned to living in fragmented and poorer areas, increased poverty and unemployment, inferior education and healthcare, public segregation in all places, and when required, mass removals from their hometowns. Approximately 3.5 million between 1960 and 83 were moved in such a way. Enforced by a large and powerful police force and army, the South African Defence Force. By 1978, apartheid South Africa was spending over 20% of its annual budget on so-called defence. This is what they mean by defence. That's a solitary confinement cell. Those ropes indicate the numerous hangings of those who chose to resist. This is a Casper, the military vehicle that they used to invade black townships to enforce their rule. Needless to say, there was a response by the African National Congress. A new determined leadership under Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela and co. created a wide umbrella of opposition, launching the Freedom Charter in '55, embracing all races and creeds. In August '56, for instance, 20,000 women protested outside the Union Buildings, Parliament, in Pretoria against the extension of pass laws 2 women. Then came the treason trial of 156 ANC leaders from 1956 to 61. All were eventually acquitted. This is Nelson Mandela, and that's Ronnie Casrills, a senior commander of MK Umkhonto Sizwe, the underground army of the ANC, and in fact was the commander for the London recruits, but more on that in a while. On March the 21st, 1960 was a game changer, the Sharpville Massacre. Peaceful protesters against the past laws were brutally gunned down with at least 67 dead, 200 injured. Sadly, this was followed by the capture of Madiba Mandela, August 62, when traveling in a car in disguise as a chauffeur to a meeting, following a tip-off from a collaborator. Then, worse still, came the capture of 17 ANC leaders, meeting secretly as they did periodically at Liliesleaf Farm, Rivonia. They were developing the new ANC strategy, including armed resistance to apartheid. They included Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, Ahmed Kathadra, Dennis Goldberg, Andrew Mafengeni, Raymond Alaba, Mac Maharaj, and so on. Later, of course, many of these comrades were to serve in the first freely elected government under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. However, in 1963, the police and army gloated that they'd set back the resistance of the ANC for a generation. They were wrong. But it was for a while a real hammer blow. The subsequent infamous trial, followed by decades in prison on Robben Island. Fortunately, not all the leaders were caught, such as the General Secretary of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, Bram Fisher, the communist and Afrikaner lawyer who brilliantly defended Madiba, Winnie Mandela, despite periods in prison and banning orders, Joe Slovo, MK and Communist Party leader, Ruth First, later murdered in Mozambique by a parcel bomb sent by the South African secret police, Albertina Sisulu, Ronnie Casrills, many others. That's Robben Island, where, of course, the leaders and many other prisoners, many other combatants resisting apartheid were sent for long periods of imprisonment. In June 1976, there was another game changer. The brutal slaughter of hundreds of children and young people by the police and the army, particularly in Soweto, protesting against the imposition of Afrikaans in the black segregated schools. Many shot in the back while running away from the police. Overall, 575 were killed, of which 494 were black, including 13-year-old Hector Peterson. Inevitably, during this time came a response. This long-established multiracial movement committed to peaceful protests revised its strategy in close alliance with the South African Communist Party, SACP, the trade unions, COSATU, and others. Thus, the 4 pillars of struggle were born: mass action by the people, underground networks, international solidarity, not least of which the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and a secret army of resistance, Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK for short. It means Spear of the Nation. The ANC's very reluctant turn to armed resistance was in direct response to the regime's militarization of South Africa and their suppression of all forms of legitimate protest or basic human rights. They did, post-75, get support from the frontline states following the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, and thus able to get backing from Mozambique and Angola, not least of which important support too from Cuba and the Soviet Union. We saw the emergence of the Black Consciousness movement led by Steve Biko, the rise of black trade unions who initiated a wave of strikes in the 70s to improve the oppressive working conditions and poor pay for black workers. Before I say a little bit more about the London recruits, I want to make it clear in the context I've just described that throughout the long, bitter decades of struggle, the overwhelming burden of suffering and sacrifice fell on the millions of black women and men in South Africa's townships, particularly Soweto, the cradle of the revolution. They adhered to the famous words of Dolores Ibárruri, heroic member of Republican Spain's parliament, when resisting General Franco's fascist coup in '36, declared, "Better to die on your feet than live on your knees." However, the impact of apartheid's killings, mass arrests, torture, bannings, imprisonment of leaders on Robben Island meant, for a while, in the late 60s and early 70s, the movement within South Africa was largely silenced. That's why the London recruits at that particular point played an important role in the fight back, showing the value of international solidarity. Linked to the sizable South African community in London, the ANC and SACP regrouped under the leadership of Yusuf Dadoo, Joe Slovo, Ronnie Kasrils, and Eric Hodgson. One of their key initiatives was the London recruits, so called because they were mostly recruited in and around London. Ronnie Kasrils, then a student at LSE, was our commander. These pictures, by the way, show the conditions of the leaders and other ANC prisoners on Robben Island. This is a photo of Madida's very bare and basic solitary confinement cell. That's the quarry they were forced to do hard labor in. That's the memorial to Hector Peterson and all those that fell in 1976. Oh, that was a moment I met Mac Maharaj at that memorial. That was cool.
Ahmed Kathadra.
Yes, thank you for correcting my pronunciation. These, by the way, are young people that each year have a vigil the night before the Youth Day, and they very generously invited us to participate on one occasion. And they have this vigil to mark the anniversary of that appalling tragedy. So, that's Hector Peterson being carried away. That's Mandela, by the way, burnt years before, burning his passport before he went underground. That's Ronnie with 2 combatants from the MK, with his wife Eleanor, who was also seriously involved in the struggle. 2 women combatants of MK. This is a list of the women prisoners who lost their lives in the central prison in Joburg. Ronnie getting his medal for his contribution to the struggle from one of the less illustrious presidents. I'll come to the high tech in a moment, but I want to say something now about the London recruits themselves. Who were they? What were their missions? Well, simply put, they were a network of young, idealistic internationalists who willingly stepped into the breach at the request of exiled ANC and SACP leaders. They had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose by volunteering to go to South Africa. They were very young, mostly in their early 20s. Women and men, mainly young workers and some students from different backgrounds and a variety of political formations on the left. Crucially, they were all white, using their colour as a disguise to more easily enter South Africa and undermine the regime, using racism against itself. These volunteers, or as Ronnie often calls them, smugglers, necessarily operated in complete secrecy in self-contained units. Unaware of each other's existence, their job was to smuggle in propaganda leaflets, set up street broadcasts using a combination of bucket bombs, I'll describe them one in a minute, establish secure communications between the ANC leadership and its units inside South Africa, and later on some even transported and stored weapons for MK. The impact of their activities both within and outside South Africa was significant, although perhaps we didn't fully realize that at the time. But they kept the flame alive. They gave hope to the struggle. As you can see, they also used very advanced technology. Consisting of a plastic bucket with large numbers of smuggled leaflets covered over with a little platform underneath and a small explosive device and a timer, which of course, when placed in a public square or by a railway station where black workers were coming in to Joburg or Durban or Port Elizabeth or Cape Town to work, and then the London recruits who placed it could then set it to go off, and it would explode and shower thousands of leaflets up into the air. Very effective. But of course, in order to get the leaflets into the country to set off the bucket bombs, they had to be smuggled in. And here's one of our brave London recruits, Tom Bell, or as he always says, one of the fabulous Bell brothers. Him and his brother were a team, with one of the suitcases with a secret compartment disguised by this design that threw the eye. And underneath that were the leaflets. That's Dennis with Ronnie in the background at one of our meetings in South Africa when we went over there to have a reunion and to go around the country and meet with veterans of the struggle. And he's describing his mission and using the aforementioned high-tech suitcase. This is when a few of us had the honor of meeting Motlanthe, who was then the deputy president of South Africa. That was quite a moment. And that's on the right-hand side at Stuart Round, who drove the Africa hinterland truck that went into the country on many occasions with smuggled weapons for MK. To his left then is Bob Newland, one of the London recruits, Ronnie, then Dennis Walsh, Ken Keeble, of course, one of the very first, and did a brilliant job in initiating the book. Yours truly at the back, and then another recruiter for the London recruits, George. This is Rivonia, Lillesley Farm, that's now been converted into effectively a museum to keep the memory alive of where the leadership used to meet secretly and plan its strategy. And also, and those stones commemorated, also to commemorate those that fell in this long and bitter struggle. That's the truck, by the way, that they used to take in weapons under the seats of unsuspecting tourists, because of course it did organize adventurous safaris, but of course they were a little bit more adventurous than the authorities were aware of. Some more of the London recruits. On the left-hand side, the second person in, that's Norman Lucas, a ship's photographer at one point whilst going to South Africa to carry out his mission. Very significantly in the middle there, Mary Chamberlain, one of the heroic women London recruits, who got married specifically in order to go to South Africa to carry out the mission with her partner. And of course, young white honeymoon couple taking out an enormous amount of boxes and cases, in which was an enormous amount of leaflets and so on for the underground. So, and that's Comrade Wolpe, who a veteran of the struggle, who is the director of Rivonia. This is the history exhibition of MK being inaugurated, being launched. Oh, that's Erika Hodgson, another veteran of the struggle, accompanied by the GDR's ambassador and the illustrious Tom Bell. And this is a reference to the London recruits in possibly the darkest days of apartheid, following the security crackdown, which led to an entire liberation movement leadership being incarcerated. Mysterious signs of resistance, existence of the outlawed ANC began to appear. This is the distribution of leaflets, the bucket bombs, and so on. And of course, that was the London recruits activity. Just some of the suitcases used in what were over 200 trips by this network of London recruits. And here is an illustration of the impact in South Africa itself, where Tom is explaining to them how we carried out the missions, and they were done simultaneously in several cities. And of course, that got the very impact that we were hoping for. Oh, I'll come to this plaque that Bob's holding up, a picture of the plaque, in a moment, because that's, for some of us, well, for all of us, a very significant contribution. In fact, I'll talk about it now. This was to do with the Aventura project, which attempted to smuggle weapons in for MK and MK combatants by sea, a boat going down the eastern side of South Africa from Somalia. Unfortunately, due to a number of problems, that particular project didn't come off. However, before and after, the very brave Liverpool seamen involved made a significant contribution to the struggle. And I refer to George Cartwright, Pat Newman, Eric Caddick, Roger O'Hara, and Bill McCaig. And on the outside of my union, which is Union's regional building in Liverpool, there's a plaque, and Bob's holding up a little badge showing that in small scale, and that a plaque to the contribution of the Liverpool seamen, which is pretty cool. Now, so where do I come into this? Well, speaking as one of the backroom boys, nobody was more surprised than I was to be involved in all of this. Oh, this is, by the way, part of the London Recruits exhibition in at Rivonia, with quite rightly the different recruits with their picture and short personal story. This is Sean Hosey, who, along with Alex and Barras, was unfortunately captured, placed in solitary confinement, brutalized, tortured, and served 5 years. Alex and Barras served longer, but managed brilliantly to escape, but also very badly treated. I mentioned the Bell brothers before, and there's Steve, and also Dennis down the bottom there, and this is Ronnie telling the story to some of the older black veterans of MK and the ANC at Rivonia Museum, which was a very special moment, meeting those particular comrades. But to go back to it on a personal level, I was used to regular campaigns and meetings and conferences and public demonstrations. After all, we had a bit of a can-do mentality and wanted to change the world. Why not? Even if we didn't quite do it in the way we originally thought of. Hey-ho. But I realized very soon, after taking up my job in London in 1969, that there was an unofficial part of it. I obviously couldn't be considered to go to South Africa on one of these secret missions because I was a full-time official of the party's youth movement, and so my card was marked by special branch, our telephone was tapped, etc., etc. Thus, for security reasons, I couldn't go, but was therefore asked to quietly recruit trusted other comrades to consider going. So how did that happen? Well, I would periodically select a would-be volunteer, discreetly approach them about possible covert activity. And if the conversation was going well, I'd become more and more explicit about what actually I had in mind. Finally popping the question, well, would you be prepared to go to South Africa to support the underground? And the extraordinary thing, everyone I asked said, yes, I'm up for that. I would then arrange a public but secret meeting with Ronnie in a central London pub, because the best way to avoid attention is to do it out there in front amidst the public. I would go all around the houses on the London Tube to make sure I wasn't followed, I would meet him in the bar. We'd have a strange conversation out the side of our mouths, and I would pass on the details of the next recruit, whom Ronnie would then link up with, train, and dispatch for their particular mission. Now, as I say in the book, I don't want anybody to think that this is kind of James Bond stuff. Rather, you should think of a very nervous young man. That's me, by the way, not the brave recruits. A very nervous young man, and I wasn't even going out there. I ran the full range of emotions: excitement, fear, anticipation, and to a large extent, not a small degree of guilt, in case any of my recruits didn't return. In fact, 2, as I mentioned before, were caught and tortured and imprisoned. But because of our, I think, very effective security, a very large number of recruits carried out their missions safely and successfully. So, this, by the way, is the Helmsley Hotel in Cape Town. Tom and Ron, when they carried out their mission, stayed in this hotel. It wasn't quite as grand then, needless to say, and he was determined on one of our trips to locate it, and succeeded. So I was chuffed a bit to be with him on that day. He then went into the hotel and briefly explained to several of the staff the reason why we'd made this special visit to their hotel. To say the least, they were astounded. Not nearly as astounded as the hotel maid when Dennis Walsh and Graham White, preparing their leaflet bucket bombs in the hotel bedroom during the day, were shocked when the key turned in the lock of the door and in walked the maid to change the room. She was completely gobsmacked, as they were. There was a pregnant pause, and then she left. And they panicked, but then did the very clever thing. They then went and found her in the corridor, brought her back into the room, sat her down, and then explained, because she was wondering what on earth is going on with all this equipment on the beds and so on and so forth. Showed her a leaflet which she slowly read. And then she said, "So you've come all this way to help us?" At which point Dennis and Graham knew that it was going to be okay. She folded the leaflet and put it in her pinny and quietly left. And they then carried on with their mission. So, this is a post 1994 meeting in the House of Commons with Peter Hain, who has a very good track record on supporting the struggle in South Africa, as you probably know. But more on that in a moment. The struggle continued across South Africa. The ANC, the SACP, the unions rebuilt their structures. MK became a serious force, defending communities and launching periodic offensive actions. Internationally, protests spread and escalated around the world, including the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, now AXA, to stop the tours and so on, and support, as I mentioned before, from the frontline states, Cuba, the USSR, and others. You may find this hard to believe, and this meeting in the House of Commons is an example, but it's only in recent years, during the course of writing the book and several reunions, we've been able to discover most of those involved and feel able to share our history and our feelings, which for security reasons had been locked away quite literally for decades. It's been a very emotional process. Ros, my best friend and wife for the last 52 years, only knew in the early 1990s when I finally spilled the beans.
Oh, I had my superstition.
Although she had her superstitions before, suspicions before, but hadn't really got the picture. I thought perhaps she might consider that these assignations were to meet with another woman, but of course that wasn't the case, as if. For 3 years in a row, some of us have gone back to South Africa to meet with struggle leaders in Joburg, Soweto, Durban and Cape Town. So, this meeting in the House of Commons, which, by the way, Peter Hain described as probably the largest gathering of subversives in the Houses of Parliament ever. I couldn't possibly comment. That's Sean, by the way, describing his story, and this is Steve Marsling sat down there. This is Mary again explaining her mission. Meeting with Bob Stewart MP in the House. Of course, that's a picture, by the way, of the Supreme Court established after liberation in 94. We shouldn't be under any illusions about those last years before the 94 election. There were tough, protracted negotiations between the ANC and the regime. Then came Mandiba's release. Then the ANC, SACP and COSATU were unbanned, the three core elements of the Triple Alliance of the resistance. However, there was much violence. Thousands, quite literally thousands, died. Much of it as a result of the regime's covert third force promoting intercommunal violence, particularly between the ANC and Inkatha. Rise of the violent white right, and so on. However, in 94, there were free elections, and the ANC won overwhelmingly with 63% of the vote, advocating the long adopted Freedom Charter. Chapter 5 heads, "The people shall share the country's wealth." Universal suffrage came, and civil rights, a Supreme Court, expansion of social housing, and so on. That's the Supreme Court again. That's the Parliament government buildings in Cape Town, and the balcony where Mandela first addressed the people as a free man. This, by the way, is when we were kindly invited to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund to meet with the director and trustees, but more on that in a moment. The people of South Africa face enormous challenges in regards to poverty and unemployment, gross inequality, AIDS, crime, corruption. And whilst much of this is rooted in centuries of colonialism and apartheid, some of it is also self-inflicted, as demonstrated by the tragic loss of life during an industrial dispute at the Lonmin platinum mine in Marikana. Also, the rising corruption that took place, particularly under President Jacob Zuma. As a result, the ANC vote has fallen to just over 50%. Unemployment remains very high at 30%, double that for young people. The problem of poor delivery of services and so on. The initial advances under Mandela and Mbeki halted by Zuma. We now got Ramaphosa. He may not be a new dawn, but it looks like progress can be stepped up, but only through struggle. That's true whether it's in South Africa or elsewhere. So, a few concluding comments. This, by the way, is the school that Mandela voted for the first time as a free man. Ross, could you get the lead? It needs to be plugged in. The battery's getting low.
Where is it?
In there. It's there. Excuse me just a moment. Switched on. Okay. Yeah, it is. In conclusion, I want to say that the long, hard, painful struggle for liberation in South Africa came at a very heavy price. But of course, it was truly worth it. And those involved should be remembered always for what they did, including the London recruits. I want to humbly suggest that the high moral values of internationalism, solidarity, freedom and justice through collective action are well represented by the London recruits. And they stand in contrast, stark contrast, to imperialist adventures old and new. These brave young women and men offered a positive alternative to apartheid and represent a positive alternative to the current criminal activities of imperialism. If you think of the murder of black people by police in America and elsewhere, including Britain, and the legitimate rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, you can see that there is a great deal of relevance in terms of what the London recruits did. Mandela always argued that love is a natural feeling, but hate is learnt. Ditto Che Guevara said that the primary motive of a true revolutionary was love. After all, is life something an individual can buy, or is it something collectively we can create? The poison chalice of aspiration, to paraphrase an old adage, to ask me to give the poor is rightly considered charitable and okay. But ask me why the poor are poor, as they are in ever rising numbers here and abroad, is often considered subversive and not okay. I consider myself to be aspirational. I aspire to be part of a safer, more equal, just and greener and happier world. That better world is possible, and it's shown by the activities of the London recruits. Finally, I want to mention once again the book, The London Recruits, The Secret War Against Apartheid. And you remember I mentioned the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. And in that regard, I'd like to read you this from the fund's appeal. One night, just after the country's first democratic elections, I was leaving a Cape Town hotel where I had attended a meeting when a group of children ran up to my car. It was freezing, and yet they were scantily dressed. I could have given them some money, and with my conscience eased, gone home to a good night's rest. I talked to them for a while, trying to find out where they came from and where their parents were. I had a sleepless night. I knew that it was not good enough to say that their problems would be solved along with the problems of an entire country. That is when I conceived the idea of a children's fund dedicated to the needs and aspirations of our youth, and pledged 1/3 of my annual presidential salary to found and perpetuate the fund. So said Nelson Mandela. And profits from the book go to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. So, at that point, I think I've said more than enough, and I hope you found it of interest and that you've got some questions and comments to make. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Bob. Could you please unshare the screen for us, please, Bob?
Okay, hang on.
Thank you very much. And can everybody come onto the, if you want to, come into the gallery for our question and answer session?
I'll get the video on.
Thanks, everyone. So I can see one individual's already got their hand up. I've already had
Some of us are still disabled.
Sorry, if you can just leave, if you can
I don't know
just,
if you can hear me, but some of us
if
are
you
still
can just-
disabled.
if you can just leave your mute closed just for a second so that we can make the questions a little bit easier to navigate. Hello, someone's shared this. Peter Frosty, can you unshare the screen, please?
If I knew how.
If you go up to the top of the screen, you should.
There you go. Try that. That done?
No.
Right. Let's talk amongst yourself.
Yeah. So we've already got some questions in the chat, which if I can get us back to the gallery, I will ask the individuals who've already posted up questions to ask their questions. The first one is from Teo. Teo, can you hear me? If you can unmute and ask Bob your questions, please, I'd really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was really great. I have two questions. I'll ask the first one now and give others a chance. In your recent visits to South Africa, did you meet with the economic freedom fighters, the opposition group led by Jacob Malema? And what was the reception? How did it compare with meeting the ANC?
Okay, shall I respond straight away?
Certainly, yes, Bob.
Yeah. No, we didn't meet with the EFF. We were aware of their existence, and we were aware of some of the differences and different perspective they had as compared to the ANC and certainly the party, but we didn't have that opportunity. And to be honest, it wasn't that we avoided them as such. It was simply that we had a pretty full itinerary in terms of going to the different cities, meeting with the ANC, the unions, the party, and so on, and going to Robben Island, that I don't think it would have been practical. But that certainly wasn't some conscious decision on our part not to meet with them. That's all I can say, really.
We've got one question from Patrick Graham. Patrick, if you can unmute.
It's hard really how to phrase this question, but basically, how did you manage to keep yourselves, well, especially, I know you're speaking on behalf of the people who travel, but how did you manage to keep yourselves motivated in what must have been really scary and extreme conditions, knowing the consequences of how you would be treated if captured, because it would be seen as a betrayal to the white race, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I understand the question. Well, I'm glad you've asked me because I won't spare the comrades' blushes, i.e. the recruits who went out there to do the business. I think they were able to remain disciplined and focused and on the job because one, their involvement in activities in the struggle in Britain itself over a number of years. These were young, determined activists who've been involved in many campaigns. That's the first thing. Secondly, we were, and I use the word we were very much inspired by deeply held convictions about internationalism and people reaching out to each other and coming together and uniting in order to tackle common problems. And that was a deeply held, and still is, belief. And we know, and history shows it, doesn't it, that when people do unite in struggle, they can achieve anything. And that means uniting across geographical boundaries. So they were committed internationalists, and hang on. I'm trying to start my video, Lawrence, but it's for some reason it's playing up. So they were determined. And also, of course, when you're in that pressurized situation, you literally, because your neck depends on it and that of those that you're working with, demands of you that you stay, keep it together and stay focused. I'm in awe of what they did and the manner in which they did it. And all credit to them. I'm fortunate because I couldn't go, but at least I had the opportunity to be involved as a recruiter, and that was great. I should say, by the way, that when we reunited at South Africa House, a building we'd stood outside of many, many times to protest against apartheid, and we went in for those reunions, it was staggering because, of course, we only knew some of those. Each of us only knew some of the others that were involved. And when you started to look around the room, everybody's going, oh my God, she was involved. He was, what? And it was just a monumental moment. And of course, you get from moments like that real power. You get a real sense of the power of solidarity and internationalism and so on. And while where there's hope, there's always the possibility of achieving new things. And it's important that we keep the hope and the flame alive now in the current struggles around the world for equality and justice. And my goodness me, there's plenty of that.
Yeah, brilliant response, brilliant reply. I couldn't put into words how much respect I've got for what you all did, because it's just, I don't think the words have been created to honour that, but it's really, really heroic, great work that you all contributed to what is, you know, what was a struggle and what is an ongoing struggle, as you've mentioned, with what's going on still around the world. So yeah, thank you very much for just the whole insights of this evening into, you know, what you went through and what took place. But I'll leave it there because I could go on and on, because this is just, it's mind-blowing but brilliant.
If you have a question for Bob, I know some of you probably aren't too familiar with the way it works. If you just raise your hand, I've asked everyone to turn on the screen. So if you just raise your hand to ask a question. I've got one question, and then Steve, no, go on, Steve, you go first. Steve Mumby. Yeah.
Sorry, Bob, I just wanted to mention somebody who you left out, who about whom there's a nice story when you talked about the fact of the people involved in the boat from Liverpool. And somebody left out was Jerry Wong. And just a little story about that. I mean, one of the things to say is that Eric Caddick and Jerry Wong, who took part in the boat expedition, were particularly brave. It's the point Roger O'Hara's made, because they were black. But if they'd got caught, it would have been very, very, very bad for them. But I mean, unlike some of the other stories, we knew about the boat in Liverpool going back a long way. And it was a bit of an embarrassing joke, because the boat had appeared to be such a disaster. You know, it kept breaking down off the coast of Somalia, I think it was.
Yes.
And eventually the mission was aborted. You know,
yes.
And during the late 80s, a large number of ANC militants who left after Soweto came to Liverpool. They were actually sent there to study, really, in the Institute of Government, to train for being in government. And I was out drinking with some of them. And we were walking back up Windsor Street, and I said, that's the Welly Butts, which was the pub that Jerry Wong had. I said, you're going in for a pint. You know, you might be interested in meeting Jerry. He was on the boat. I mean, God, it was an embarrassing thing. They sort of stopped in the street and said, the boat? The boat? And what we hadn't seen at the time, or locally, because of course the regime, when I think the boat was exposed by Craig Williamson, who was a boss spy, said, you know, fiasco, ANC fiasco. Well, nobody believes what the papers and the media say when you're under a repressive dictatorship. And instead, what the regime did advertise was that communist seamen from Greece and the UK had attempted to smuggle ANC militants in. So to that generation of Soweto students, it was an incredibly important and politicizing moment. So it's kind of, I think the whole thing of the symbolism in those sort of things is incredibly thing. And that's why, you know, it was really important we put up that plaque in the Unite building to commemorate that bit of the Liverpool story. I'd like to get a plaque up actually where the Welly Butts is sometime, Lawrence. I think we talked about this, you know, because as I said, Jerry, when he retired from sea, ran the pub for quite a while.
His son's still around.
Can I just quickly comment? Well, first of all, thanks to Steve for correcting my omission and rounding out the story, because that's quite right and proper. And of course, in the case of Eric, who was a very, very brave comrade and militant in struggle, both in Liverpool and in terms of anti-apartheid. So yes, so thanks for that, Steve. And of course, there'll be lots of other stories that we still haven't heard. This is, if you like, unfinished business. And so I would invite anybody and everybody who's got any more information that's relevant to this narrative to bring it forward, because you know what they say, lest we forget. It's very important that we take charge of our own history and make sure that other people are aware of it and pass it on. I saw, for instance, that there's now to be new guidance issued by the Education Department saying that there shouldn't be anti-capitalist information provided in schools. I mean, I was just horrified at the blatant censorship being proposed. And of course, our history, like the London recruits, like Black Lives Matters, like the Chartists or whoever, our history is, they will readily bury at every opportunity. And it's very important that we have a pride in it, we share it, we guard it, we respect it, and we pass it on. So thanks, Steve.
Ken's got a question, sorry. Just unmute, please, Ken. You're muted. Yeah. Okay.
No, I haven't got a question. A couple of points I'd like to make, if I may. First of all, congratulate Bob Allen on that talk, the illustrated talk. I didn't know he was going to illustrate it with pictures, but it's brilliant. I really enjoyed it, and it's a very interesting way to do it. It's a tremendous job. I'm very pleased with that indeed. Can I just, I do need to correct Bob on one point though. He mentioned 2 people of the London recruits who were arrested and jailed and so on. There was 3, and it's important to remember 3. Marie-José Mumbaris, who was arrested and was very, very badly treated. I won't say tortured exactly, but certainly very roughly treated, and was eventually released from prison after 4 months. And it's important that we don't, forget. Very often the women's contribution is overlooked. So I think it's important to remember that Marie-José Mumbaris suffered in that way.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken. And funny enough, and that's my bloody awful memory, because I've actually got the cutting from the Morning Star, the excellent piece you wrote about her. And people should know that she, of course, was, as I understand it, pregnant at the time. Is that right?
That's correct.
And can you imagine? Not that I'm not making her out to be some defenseless little woman. She was an extremely brave, stoic comrade. But in those circumstances, to have a baby growing inside you, to be arrested and leaned on by the regime's forces, and she stood up to that remarkably well, and was after a period of time released. But yes, Ken's quite right. She was a very, very brave combatant in the struggle, and people like her are very important to be remembered. Thank you, Ken.
Peter's got a question. You need to take your mute off, Peter. You're muted.
Thanks, Bob. Bob, you're right about history, of course, although increasingly I find what other people call history, I kind of remember bits of my life not too far back. What you didn't mention is where the film is, and much more important, where the film's going. Where do we have any idea about how well it's going to be distributed, how it's going to be able to be viewed by, increasingly, we've all got, I hope, the joy of children and grandchildren, and some of you even great-grandchildren. And it's much more important about them viewing this than it is about me and you.
Right. Well, okay. I will say 1 or 2 things on that, but before I do, I'd like to refer to Ken, because although the film has been in production for several years, we delegated, if you like, to the Gang of 4 the responsibility of liaising with the company on the content and on the production of the film. And Ken, of course, quite rightly, as one of the London recruits, editor of the book, etc., is involved in those discussions, and he may well have a more up-to-date picture than I have. So first of all, over to Ken.
Oh, thank you, Bob. Yes, I saw the latest cut of the film just a few weeks ago, along with Ronnie Casrills and Catherine Salahi and Tom Bell, who, as you say, not the Gang of 4, but the quartet we prefer to call ourselves. And we decided that we are very pleased with it. It's not finished yet. There are a few decisions to be made because it's got to be shortened a bit. And there's some more technical work, what's called polishing, to be done on it as well. The London recruits will have a special showing of the film, unfortunately not in a cinema, but on their own computers on the 17th of December. But that will be for London recruits only. But that will be very nearly the final version of the film. There's still some more work to be done on it after what they call post-production, and it'll be there sometime after the end of February. It will go to film festivals and start to get released. But that's roughly the timetable. Every time I announce to somebody that it's going to be done next year, finished next year or something, I get shot down in flames because it hasn't been. It's been so long. But I believe, and all the four of us decided, we do believe that it's worth the waiting. We think it's very good. We recommend it to you.
Ken, you said about shortening it. Is it a full-length feature film?
It's a feature film, yes. I think it'll be 90 minutes. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
But it's what's called a feature documentary or documentary.
Drama documentary.
Don't worry. 90 minutes is what I wanted.
Yes.
I should thanks, Ken. I knew you'd have the up-to-date picture, and whilst it's been frustrating, that's the nature of the beast, and that's the nature of the protest, and we've just got to hang in there until I'm confident that it'll be great, even if the makeup department may be overly stretched in order to make some of our how can I put it, more mature comrades look good in front of camera. Fortunately, that won't include me, so that's okay. But I'm confident it'll be a good film, and I think it'll also be a great vehicle for not only showing it in cinemas and so on, but at colleges and universities, trade unions, community organizations and so forth. And the power of film, of course, as we know, is considerable. I think it'll be a great vehicle for passing on this important part of our history to a far greater number of people. So bring it on. I can't bloody wait, Ken.
I can't interrupt you.
Bob, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Now, I know when you said you all met in the House of Commons, you weren't aware of who was involved, etc. And it came as quite a shock to you. Did you ever find out who devised the idea in itself or where it came from?
And Ken or anybody else can correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially, as a result of the suppression of the movement internally in South Africa, then the leaders, exile leaders, and in particular, in this case, Ronnie Casaril's, Yusuf Dadu, and so on in London, they then began to put their thinking caps on as to how, to use my phrase, keep the flame alive and respond to that dire situation. And in their discussions, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, this was one of the projects that came up, as did the Aventura, as did Africa Hinterland, and so on, and by which the exile community could regroup and help to initiate some action, some activity that showed that the ANC was still alive and resisting apartheid. That's the nub of it. Now, of course, in addition, they had then to develop the necessary expertise, if I can use that term, in order to make these missions a practical success. And that's where certain comrades were involved in terms of designing. I mean, I joked about the low-level technology, but nonetheless, you had to think about it. How do you smuggle in leaflets and hence the suitcases? How do you distribute in a public, dramatic way thousands of leaflets to workers, and particularly black workers in South Africa, hence the design and development of the. And apparently there were some amusing experiments on one of the London parks, I forget which one, where they were testing it out until they got it right. But that's, as I understand it, where this project, the kernel of this project was developed, and then it took on a life of its own. I should say, by the way, I don't know what Ken's experience was, but whenever I met Ronnie, who, by the way, his disguise, his cover story in London was as a student at the London School of Economics, not that he did a lot of studying. And he used that as a basis to then make contacts and links and build up the network and so on. The remarkable thing is, here's somebody who's under threat 24/7. And yet, whenever I met him, and I was bricking it, but whenever I met him, he always seemed full of energy, big, that wonderful smile he had, but cool and collected, you know, not was together. And that was, of course, a great bonus. That said, at the end of the day, even if you plan it brilliantly, even if you get the technology perfect, etc., at the end of the day, you've got to have very brave, resourceful, disciplined comrades to carry out the missions. And they did superbly. Ken and the other comrades did that superbly. And they will always have my total respect for that.
Can I say something there? The person who tested the bomb was Eddie Adams. Sadly, Eddie's even worse than you and I, Bob, at technology, so he's not on here today. But he's you can spend a good evening listening to Eddie about the bomb in Richmond Park. It was you said some of the things about outside South Africa now surprised you. I don't think they surprised you as much as the bang that Eddie got when he let this thing off in Richmond Park. But I want to say something else about the origin of this, because we shouldn't forget, and I'm not going to call any particular, organisation better than any other, but I was involved in the Young Communist League, and I know still of Young Communist League leading comrades who did other jobs of similar nature, illegal or illicit, or call them what you will, heroic, taking money to Greece and in the time of the generals. It was something that happened, and it was always kept quiet, and it's still kept quiet. And I know one leading comrade who still hasn't told his wife, a wife of many, many years, even longer than you and I, Bob, I think, his wife. And he says if I tell her now what happened 50 years ago, she'd still kill me. So, this was part of our international work, and we didn't ask about it, and we didn't know what happened, and we didn't need to know it happened, because part of the success of it was dependent on us not talking about it.
Yeah, and
I know Bob Newland's got a question, and he's had his hand up for a while. So, Bob,
and Pat has a question.
It's not a question. It's to pick up a couple of the points that were asked. I was also given the enormous privilege of being asked to become one of the London recruits, and went out in 1971 with Pete Smith there to do leaflet bombs, and then in 1972 to meet the Aventura coming down from Somalia. The origin of the idea for what became the London recruits was Oliver Tambo, and Ronnie reflects on that powerfully, that he was approached by Oliver Tambo in Africa to come to London to become involved in this project. Obviously, it evolved there, and a key player alongside Ronnie was Joe Slovo, who was certainly the originator of the idea of the ship. And it was difficult, reflecting very quickly on this question of how you keep yourself motivated. We went out for 3 weeks as myself and Alex Bombaris as the welcome party at Durban for the ship. And eventually, after 8 weeks, it was cancelled. And during that 8 weeks, we had to keep moving, changing our reason for being there, providing new cover and new things. And at one point, when it was all on hold, but we were told we had to be ready to come back after a week, we dispersed out of Durban just so that we didn't look really, really stupid. But I just wanted to just, you know, clarify that question of Oliver Tambo being the key person in the first instance, and the key role of Joe Slovo alongside so many others. And the other place that the bombs were tested was Hampstead Heath as well, although I think because of the involvement of a comrade in Bristol, it was also tested in Bristol as well.
Yeah. Teo has a question.
Pat?
Yes, hello. Hello, Bob.
Hi.
Sorry, just a second. Sorry, Teo's got his hand up, but if Pat, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Bob, I'm really interested in the film. I'd just like to know if it's a film you can watch in its own right, which is exciting about the London recruits, or is it put into historical context for people who don't really know the history of the apartheid struggle?
I'm going to refer you again, Pat, to Ken, and I may then have one or two things in addition to say, but Ken, having seen the rough cut version, I think is better placed to answer that. Ken?
Oh, well, yes, I think it does put it in context, yes.
So does it put it into context for people who don't really know the history of South Africa?
Yes, possibly not enough. I can't remember now on that particular point, but yes, it's not, the context is not left out.
Right, okay, thanks.
Okay. Teo?
Hi, sorry, I thought somebody else wanted to comment on that because my question is different. It was...
We've got plenty of time, we can come back.
Okay, all right, yes. The meeting that you had at the House of Commons with Peter Hain, was Jeremy Corbyn at that meeting? And I wonder if you have a view on Peter Hain's apparent shift since he set up the Stop the
Tours.
70 tour movement, because if I remember rightly, when Jeremy Corbyn started being attacked for his support of Palestine, Peter Hain became part of that attack. Any comments on that, please?
Well, I think in terms of tonight, it's probably not appropriate for me to get onto that kind of territory. I'm not avoiding it on political grounds. I just think it's not, that's a whole subject in itself. No, Jeremy Corbyn and other leaders of the Labour Party weren't involved. It was a specific gathering with regards to the London recruits, and it was appropriate for that to be hosted by Peter Hain because of his involvement, Stop the Tour and anti-apartheid and so on. And we had the ambassador from South Africa there. We had Ronnie Caswell as our commander there, and so on. And so it served a very specific purpose, and it was a very, very successful meeting. But of course, it wasn't the only meeting, because that was in the House of Commons. We had separate gatherings in South Africa House itself, where the London recruits came together to meet with, obviously, representatives of the new South African government, if you like. And they were great, because it gave us a chance to come together and see who'd been involved, and to share our thoughts and our feelings. The only thing I would say is that because of the lesson, because there are important lessons to be learned from this particular national liberation struggle and the London recruits' involvement in it, the value of internationalism, the value of solidarity what can be achieved when people come together in this way in struggle, that those lessons are very important for us to pass on. So any opportunity we have to meet with leaders and activists in trade unions, in the Labour Party, in other left bodies, and so on, we should exploit, and I use that term in the best sense of it, we should make use of, in order that people can, we can encourage people to learn the lessons of this history and build on them. And my God, there's a desperate need for that at the moment. If you look at the political crisis in this country, you look at the situation in America, you look at the desperate situation faced by Palestinians, etc., etc. That's the job of work that we need to do. I'm not going to be prescriptive about it. In fact, a very important lesson was from the London recruits is that we were very, whilst it was a secret project, it was also a very open project. For instance, Ronnie, as the commander, went out of his way to make contact with and recruit from a range of people, including communists, socialists, Trotskyists, and so on and so forth. So, and we make no apology for that, absolutely the right approach. That said, yes, I can say with some pride that a huge contribution in terms of the London recruits was made specifically by the Young Communist League and by members of the YCL. That I don't think anybody would realistically dispute that, and they did a great job. So, as far as the wider picture is concerned, I think we need to, and I know some of the people involved tonight, but we're involved in quite a wide range of organisations. Some are in the Labour Party, some are in other parties, some are in a number of trade unions, etc. And we should, whatever best avenue is open to us, we should make full use of that to tell this story and what it can mean in terms of current struggles. That's the positive message I want to focus on.
Thank you. Macau, do you have a question?
Yes, good evening. This is Louis from South Africa. And thanks to Bob, Ken, and you, Lawrence, for making it possible for me to also participate. Here is a book. Cool. Yes. I happen to be working on women in liberation armies. And that's why I, managed to get hold of the book, and also Ken last week. My question is for Bob. From those women that you recruited, as I'm particularly interested in women, are there others that perhaps are willing to share, their stories, their experiences as they were, embarking on this noble cause? And for Bob Newland, I did not quite get what you were mentioning. I don't know if you mentioned a ship when you were making your presentation a short while ago about Durban, because I remember there was Operation J, which happened around in the 1970s, which did not take off the ground, where they were recruiting, they wanted to bring recruits, or rather the trained guerrillas, by ship, but that project did not succeed. I don't know if indeed you mentioned a ship, and if that was in relation to that. Thank you.
Okay, Lawrence, the second question, I think Bob and Ken can usefully add to what I've already said. But in terms of the first question, then it's very important that the women who were centrally involved in this struggle, and the women London recruits like Catherine and Mary and so on, that their story is told as widely as anybody else's, and they're more than willing to do that. And in fact, I've heard Mary speak. I mean, she's not only a brave comrade, but she's a very fine intellectual and writer and so on, and more than capable of telling the story. So and we should make sure that their voice is heard. In terms of the ship, which may or may not be the Aventura that Comrade is referring to, but Ken or Bob or both may want to say further to what I've already said.
Yes, can I come in there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, the Aventura was what the Soviet people who paid for it called Operation J, and I've got it, you can read about it in this book, ANC: The View from Moscow, by Vladimir Shubin, who was sort of the Kremlin's man in southern Africa and the key link between the Soviet government and the African National Congress. It's all in there. They called it Operation J, apparently after Joe Slovo. And there was, as far as I know, the Soviet Union paid for the purchase of the yacht Aventura. So yes, that's quite correct. There was some other question that was asked and I've lost it. Sorry, there was another
women
raised.
I did try to answer that, Comrade. I don't know whether you're happy with the answer, but by all means, come back to me.
Are you still there, Macau? If you, yeah, you're still on mute. Just remove your mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm happy. Perhaps I would contact Bob, you know, for him to, you know, link me up with those women that are still willing to share.
Okay, cool.
Great stuff.
Oh, I know the other question. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Ken. What was? Did you want to respond to Macau? Because I've got another question.
Just about Lord Hayne, Peter Hayne.
Okay, can we come back to that just so I get Lisa's question in? So Lisa's asked the question via chat, and it goes: were there meetings focused on supporting the women's group of the ANC? She was at a fundraising meeting in New York. Doesn't say when. Doesn't want to, but yeah, she was there.
What? Sorry, were which meetings? Which meetings is she referring to?
Are you going to let us?
I'll unmute. I'll unmute. Hi.
Hi.
I don't remember the years. I mean, it had to be in the late 80s. There were groups of, I was at least one fundraiser in the Bronx to support the women's group of the ANC. And hearing this wonderful session and thinking about your flyers, one of the things we were told was that our fundraising was going to buy the women's part of the ANC mimeograph machines so that literature could be spread around. But I didn't know if there were specific women's ANC groups that any of you were involved in. And it's just so, you know, wonderful to see all of this and to think about you going back.
Right.
Sorry, you're listening to New York in the background. I'm calling from New York.
Right. Okay. Well, and good to hear from you in New York. And take care and stay safe. But
yes,
yeah, in every sense of the word, in your current situation, I'm not aware that in terms of the London Recruits story and project, as it were, I'm not aware of specific meetings or activities just for women. Not that the comrades would be against that. On the contrary, we were focused on doing a particular job.
Yes, of course.
Support the underground and the armed struggle, and that was it really. And all the meetings and activities were focused on that. But of course, they did involve a good mix of men, young men and young women, and all of them very, very brave. And certainly people like Mary and Catherine and so on are very capable. They've demonstrated that by what they did, but they're very capable spokespersons for this struggle. And maybe you may want to link up with one or two of them, and I'm sure they won't be averse to that, and you'll have no problem making contact.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know there was also meetings held here to support the women's arm of the ANC throughout the 80s, and a number of meetings were held. I've got some of the old flyers actually, so if you're interested.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry?
Yes.
Sam, can I say it's lovely to hear police cars in New York. We were looking out the window to see if they were going past our house. Sam, one of the great things for me of this time, Anne and I, my wife Anne and I were lucky enough, we just had a baby, literally, and I think whoever looked at the list of names said, don't send them, they're busy enough, and I'm deeply relieved by that I never had to go and prove my courage. But what was so great for us in that time, we'd read about internationalism, but it leapt out of the page. We met Americans who draft dodging. We met Vietnamese, a young Vietnamese girl who'd been involved in the massacres in Vietnam, and I chaired a meeting in London with this woman speaking. This was internationalism in working, not just on the page.
Yes, and just in response to that, Lawrence, for everybody else's sake, that's very true, and it places the London Recruits Project in a context. For many of our generation, it became a way of life to be involved in solidarity campaigns in support of, in defense of the Cuban Revolution, in support of the Vietnamese struggle against America, and so on. I can remember speaking publicly weekend after weekend in Nottingham Slab Square to raise money to buy bikes, which the Vietnamese then strengthened in order to carry their equipment and food and resources through the jungle, and which we then transported to Sofia, to the World Youth Festival, in a lorry to hand over to the Vietnamese. And that sort of activity for us was kind of, I don't mean this in a big-headed way, but that was kind of normal. That was what you did. And you stood on platforms and you condemned the racists and Enoch Powell on the far right, and you supported trade unions, and you supported the Vietnamese, and you did that as a regular modus operandi, as it were. And so it was in our genes, it was in our blood. But the difference with the South African struggle was the London Recruits contribution was that this was personal. This wasn't about sending bikes to Vietnam, important though that was, or protesting on demos in Trafalgar Square, important though that was, or standing outside Africa House and kicking off, or similarly about Cuba. This was personal. This was where we were asking individuals on behalf of the wider collective to go into an extremely dangerous situation to do the business. And that's what's special about it. The fact that they volunteered to carry out these missions at great personal risk, and they, and to their credit, did a great job. That was the difference.
Adrian has a question for Bob, I think.
I just partly want to say that I'm at this meeting because Teo told me about it this afternoon. So thank you for that. My particular interest in this is that I was living in Cape Town in the early 70s. I was a young person born in Cape Town. And I remember hearing about these, reading about these leaflet bombs going off. And it was exhilarating. It was extremely exciting to realize that there was actually a resistance was happening in
Oh, that's cool to hear that.
And that was and, not that I was the audience, but I came from a radical family who was opposed to apartheid, and the fact that was going on was amazing. So, and I have this kind of memory, possibly a false memory, of actually hearing an explosion, and because I was reading about these and I knew it was going on. It was incredible. I just want to share that. But I have a question as well, because the other thing, my other recollection from that same period in the early 70s was walking around my neighborhood, my suburb in Cape Town, and seeing graffiti on walls like "End Apartheid." And I sort of now, I mean, well, I want to say the other thing was I always wondered who these brave people who were setting these off. And it's great to actually now to have found that out. But oh yeah, I also saw graffiti, "End Apartheid" on walls around my neighborhood and things. And I'm assuming that was by the same people, the same thing. Does someone have any knowledge about that? Was graffiti also one of the strategies that was implemented? I haven't really heard that too much, so I don't know if maybe Ken or Bob can say.
Don't assume it was the same people. I'm not aware that in particular we did that our guys did that. Some of them may have done, but there was a lot of sporadic and spontaneous resistance activity, and that would include graffiti in different communities opposed to apartheid. And secondly, don't say that you weren't part of the audience, because you were. Yes, of course, it was important, particularly important, to address the black majority, because they were the ones that were being fundamentally oppressed. But of course, we were not unaware of the potential impact on any of the white population or other groups that might be influenced. Because once you start to, I can remember my dad saying to me, I learned a lot from my dad. I remember him saying to me, "Do you know what, lad? It's not about knowing all the answers. It's about asking the right questions." And once you encourage people to ask questions and to reconsider what they take as the normal, the accepted normal, once you trigger that can have a big impact, big implications. And of course, we were interested in influencing anybody and everybody. And of course, the white people had the power. So you were part of the audience, even though it was primarily aimed at the black oppressed majority. It's good to hear from you. If you've not already got a copy of the book, order one and get it and read it, and also encourage friends to, because as I said before, it's our history and we need to guard it and pass it on.
I have got the book. I bought it at the Mandela exhibition in London a couple of years ago.
Right. Okay. Forgive my unashamed advertising of the
I need to start promoting it.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
We've got a couple of minutes left.
You haven't changed a bit, Bob.
Pat, Teo mentioned we've got a couple of veterans in the room who haven't spoken yet. Do they want to say anything? We got a word, Peter?
I've said all I need to say.
No, not Frosty Smith.
Sorry?
Just to thank you for this event, and just to pick up on the last statement, certainly when I did the second mission with Bob Newland in Johannesburg, my understanding was there was in the book you'll see, we had problems placing the leaflet bombs in areas that we had selected. My understanding was that there was still some resistance in South Africa, and disturbances were arranged such that the police in South Africa, as many would be encouraged to leave the centre to assist us with regard to the leaflet bombs. But we certainly weren't involved in any graffiti, and I would imagine that was a local issue.
Yeah.
Patrick had a question.
It's actually, there might be a question at the end of it, but it's just more of a statement, something I've just put in the chat, but just for those who didn't see it, because I did mean to add this on to when I spoke with Bob before, that's the question. But basically, it's taken from something what Bob said, but I'll just read out what I put in the chat. I wish to commend the wives and husbands who never knew what the partners were up to, and the great support and understanding that they displayed in learning what was going on. Like, it must have also been a great burden, as Bob Allen had pointed out, in keeping these secrets and risking being accused of infidelity and some of the sneaking about that would have taken place. You know, and it's just that saying, behind every great man, you know what I mean? And it just shows great strength of character to those partners and the understanding, because you were actually, you know, obviously putting them at risk, because as you said, Bob, you were under surveillance from special branch and this and that, and clearly that would have included your partner and so forth. So, you know, it's just, how did you feel, just to add a question onto that, how did you feel at times, because obviously these are thoughts which you would have had, knowing that that would have been the case, and your wife was unaware during the, most of this period as to what your real activities was. How did that make you feel at times?
Stressful. I should hasten to add that Ros, like the partners of other comrades, is a long-standing activist herself. She's very clear about which side of the fence she's on, so we operated very much in tandem, particularly when I was working for the movement on not the greatest of wages, and she was the main earner and was and is a crucial support to me in all this. In terms of the sense of responsibility, I don't know how others felt, but it impacted on me quite heavily. And I'm not complaining, I'm just being honest. And I remember a particular incident completely unrelated to this that demonstrates that. I met for a pint, I won't go into too many details. I met for a pint in the pub with a comrade from the north of Ireland, right? Perfectly innocent gathering over a pint, chewing the fat and the situation and so on. And within 24 hours, I got a phone call, a very strange phone call from the police to the office. He gave his name and so on, but I knew straight away it was Special Branch, and wanting to speak with me, and he wouldn't discuss what it was over the phone. I then get a visit the following day, and he also was reluctant to have a conversation in our office. I think under the illusion that we might have the money and the resources to actually have counter surveillance equipment in the place, as if. So we took a walk around the local park, and I then got quite a serious questioning about this person I'd met. And because what they were trying to do was to try and create the idea that we had a link with, as they would see it, dodgy elements in the north of Ireland. They knew we supported in the broad sense the Republican cause and supported the idea of a united Ireland. And that illustrated to me very sharply in that one example that the office and our people were being watched. And don't get me wrong, I've no delusions about my importance then or now in that sense. But so you have to be real, and you have to deal with the world as it is. And that's why, so when I was recruiting people, I was very aware of my responsibility to do it right, because I was asking comrades to do something extremely dangerous. I mean, when each one returned with a slight after coming back from their mission, I was relieved, but then the circle of emotions was repeated the next time I recruited somebody. So for me, not necessarily for me, I found it very stressful. Exciting, worthwhile, yes, but not easy, not easy.
Yeah, I'll just thank you, because you know I could imagine that anyway, but it's just good to hear an honest opinion as to how, you know, it would have clearly impacted, because at the end of the day we're only all human, you know. And but yeah, great stuff. Because even just the burden of you having the knowledge of the various people that you've recruited, and you know how someone may even attempt to try and extract that knowledge from you. You know what I mean?
Yes, but yes,
that creates distress.
On that, yes. Just quickly, I was aware that there was always the possibility of some leakage and then getting leaned on by special branch. But if it was not likely that I was going to get hammered, leaned on a bit maybe, and so on. But you know, hey ho. But I was also aware of the crucial role of security, and we really buttoned it down, and that's why very few of our people got caught. There was no breach of security our end in Britain. I'm very proud of that fact. Comrades really were disciplined, and the party made it very Jack Waddis made it very clear as to what was required in terms of keeping stum. Hey ho.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Guys, we've just run out of time, so I'll close the meeting now. Thank you so much to Bob for giving us so much of his time so generously. So I'll give you a virtual clap, Bob. Thank you so much, pal. And it's been amazing talking to you. We've had a lot of discussions offline, and I'd just like to thank you for all your contributions. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Take care, everyone.
Okay. Cheers. Thanks, comrades.
Yeah,
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.